The morning haze over the Coral Sea shimmered like a mirage as 4 U.S. Navy F4F Wildcats clawed upward into the sun. Their engines roared, heavy and ungraceful compared to the elegant, deadly A6M Zeros that circled above them like hawks. Lieutenant Commander Jack Bricks Ellison tightened his grip on the stick and squinted into the glare. Somewhere up there, beyond the glint of sunlight, were 20 Japanese fighters. Faster, lighter, and flown by men who'd been hunting American planes since Pearl Harbor. His squadron, VF-9, was battered. Their carrier, USS Lexington, had lost half its fighters in the past 2 weeks. Every engagement felt like survival against the inevitable. The Zero could outclimb, outturn, and outroll the Wildcat in almost every way. The American pilots had learned to fight defensively, using armor and rugged frames to stay alive. But it wasn't enough. That's when Ellison started thinking differently. He had been watching how the Zeros attacked, how they swooped down in spirals, coordinated their dives, and always tried to bait the Wildcats into dogfights they couldn't win. But what if the trap could be reversed? What if the slower planes could dictate the fight? In the ready room the night before, he'd grabbed a matchstick from his pocket, snapped it in half, and set the pieces on the table. "Boys," he said quietly, "this is how we'll kill them tomorrow." The younger pilots laughed, until they saw his eyes. He wasn't joking. The ready room smelled of stale coffee and fear. The 4 men sat around the metal table, the hum of the carrier's engines faint beneath their boots. Commander Ellison stood at the head, a half-smoked cigarette trembling between his fingers, the stub of a matchstick rolling across a map of the Solomon Islands. "Here's what's been killing us," he said, tapping the matchstick against a drawn loop of flight paths. "The Zero climbs higher, turns faster, and bleeds us dry one by one. They come down in a spiral, peel off, then re-engage while we're still trying to roll out. We can't beat them at their game." He took another matchstick, laid it parallel to the first, then crossed 2 more diagonally between them. "This," he said, "is our game." He explained the idea slowly, letting the room sink into silence. 2 Wildcats would climb high and hold formation, flying close, dangerously close, like the 2 parallel matchsticks. The other 2 would lag behind, weaving below as bait. When the Zeros dive, the bait boys pull away hard. They'll go for you first, they always do. That's when the top pair drop down together, wings almost touching. You'll come down like a single aircraft, 1 gun sight, double the fire." He looked up at the wide-eyed men. "The Japs think in one-on-one terms. That's their religion, the duel. So we give them 1 target, but it spits twice as much lead." A nervous laugh broke out, but it faded quickly. They all knew how insane the idea was. Flying wingtip-to-wingtip during a combat dive was suicide. 1 mistake, 1 gust, and you'd shear off your buddy's wing. But Ellison pressed on. "We can't outfly them. So we'll outthink them. And if you get hit, you're not alone up there. Your partner's got your 6, always." He flipped his cigarette into an ashtray and stared at the map. "Tomorrow, we make them think we're desperate. Then we make them regret it." That night, as the ship rocked gently beneath them, no one slept. Some prayed. Some wrote letters home. And on 1 scrap of paper, Ellison scrawled a simple note. "For Wildcats. 20 Zeros. Watch the matchsticks burn." At dawn, the order came, enemy formation approaching, 18 miles out. The experiment was about to begin. The sky over the Coral Sea was blood orange when the Wildcats took off. The ocean below was calm and infinite, a deceptive mirror of peace. Ellison led the flight, his call sign Brick 1, followed by Brick 2, Brick 3, and Brick 4. The name came from his reputation, solid, unshakable, but today, even his hands trembled on the throttle. "Formation Echo, stay tight," Ellison said into his radio. "Remember the matchsticks." The F4Fs climbed steadily, their heavy engines growling as they pushed through the dawn haze. Fuel was tight. Every second of throttle meant less time to fight. Their task was simple in words, suicidal in execution: intercept a Japanese strike formation reported heading toward the task force. At 12,000 feet, sunlight burst across the canopy, blinding for a second. Then they saw them, tiny glints to the northeast, moving fast. Zeros. 2 squadrons, maybe more. 20 aircraft cutting across the sky in perfect formation, like silver sharks slicing water. Contact, bearing 085. Altitude 14, reported Brick 2. Ellison's mind raced. They had maybe 30 seconds before contact. Brick 3 and 4, drop to 9,000. Play the bait. Keep your wings level, make them believe you're lost. Roger that, came the reply, thin and nervous. See you downstairs, boss. As the 2 Wildcats peeled away, Ellison and his wingmen pulled higher, the engine straining. At 14,000 feet, they leveled off, silent, invisible above the sun's glare. The Japanese formation broke apart smoothly, like clockwork. The first 6 Zeros peeled downward toward the bait. Ellison could already hear the chatter over the radio, the strained breathing, the shouted warnings. He's on me! Jesus, he's... Then gunfire. No, Ellison said, voice low and calm. The 2 top Wildcats rolled onto their backs and dove. Air screamed against the fuselage, the world turning into a blur of clouds and sun. His wingmen's wingtips were less than 10 feet away, too close, but Ellison held steady, eyes locked on the twisting melee below. The Japanese never saw them coming. At 400 knots, the pair sliced through the formation like blades. Ellison fired a short burst. Tracers stitched through a Zero mid-turn, its left wing erupting in flame. His wingmen's guns followed, shredding another that tried to climb. The enemy scattered in confusion. From below, Brick 3 shouted, "They're breaking! Commander, they're breaking!" Ellison's jaw clenched. Good. Let's make them dance. And with that, for Wildcats dove again, slow, stubborn, but suddenly lethal. The fight exploded into chaos. The sky filled with contrails, streaks of tracer fire, and the dying arcs of burning planes. The Zeros, used to circling their prey like graceful predators, now found themselves reacting, uncertain, disoriented, and caught in a formation they couldn't read. Ellison's voice cut through the radio static. Matchsticks, roll right. Stay paired. His wingman, Ensign Davis, matched his movement perfectly. They banked as one, crossing paths so close Ellison could see the other man's face through the canopy, sweat streaming, eyes wild with focus. A Zero cut across their front, its pilot overconfident from countless easy kills. Ellison yanked the stick, timed the lag of his heavy Wildcat, and fired a tight burst. The .50 Callies roared, a thunderclap that tore through the morning sky. The Japanese fighter disintegrated in a flash of smoke and debris. Splash 1, Davis called. Below, the bait pair, Ensigns McCarthy and Holt, were struggling to shake 2 Zeros that had latched onto them. They dove hard, engines screaming, just feet above the water. Salt spray streaked the windshields. Brick 3, hang on! Ellison barked. We're dropping! He and Davis cut their throttles and plunged. The Wildcats rattled violently, the air compressing against their thick frames. At 400 knots, they were nearly uncontrollable. Ellison's altimeter spun. Clouds shredded past. Then he saw them, 2 silver Zeros behind McCarthy, their wings flashing in the sun as they closed for the kill. Now! Both Wildcats opened fire simultaneously, crossing the enemy's line like twin blades. 1 Zero erupted, shearing apart midair. The other pulled up, panicked, right into Davis's gun sight. Tracers found its fuel tank, and it vanished in a fireball. McCarthy's strained laugh came over the comms. Hell, Commander, that's 2 of mine you stole. Ellison smirked, adrenaline buzzing in his veins. Keep flying, son. You'll have plenty left. But even as they regrouped, more black dots appeared in the distance. Reinforcements. Eyes up, Ellison warned. We're not done yet. Above them, 8 new Zeros dove from the sun. The sky was about to turn into hell again. Ellison's gut tightened as the new wave of Zeros fell upon them like hawks. The air was alive with the metallic shriek of diving engines and the crack of machine guns. Tracers zipped past the Wildcats in bright, angry lines, forcing them to juke and roll while keeping formation. "Stay tight, matchsticks!" Ellison barked into the radio, his voice steady but sharp. "If you break off, you die." The Wildcats had the advantage of surprise once. Now they had to rely on coordination. They weren't faster, they weren't lighter, but they could fight as one. The lead Zero tore through the center, guns blazing. Ellison and Davis rolled in unison, a synchronized maneuver that caused the Japanese pilot to overcorrect. As the Zero shot past, the two Wildcats flipped back and fired, double streams of .50 caliber shells converging into a storm. The Zero disintegrated mid-turn. But the others were learning fast. They split into pairs, attacking from multiple angles, forcing the Wildcats to separate. "3, this is 1, break left, they're trying to split us. I'm hit. Port wing's smoking." McCarthy's voice came through, strained, the sound of cracking metal in the background. "Still flying, Commander." Ellison scanned the sky, smoke trails, sun glare, flickering wings, chaos. He spotted McCarthy below, his plane limping, a Zero closing fast. Without thinking, he nosed over, the G-forces pressing his body into the seat as he dove. "Davis, with me." They descended through the chaos like a hammer. Ellison lined up the Zero, squeezed the trigger, and nothing happened. The guns jammed? Damn it! He slammed the side of the cockpit, pulling up just in time to avoid colliding with McCarthy's tail. The Zero banked left, trailing smoke from Davis's burst. The Japanese pilot bailed out a moment later, his parachute blooming like a pale flower in the burning sky. Ellison steadied his breathing. "Good shooting, too." "I'm dry, guns jammed." "Your lead now." There was no hesitation in Davis's reply. "Copy that, Commander. Let's finish this." The four Wildcats regrouped, circling into a tight defensive spiral, back to back, wingtips nearly touching, like a spinning carousel of steel and fire. It was madness, but it worked. Every time a Zero dove, two guns met it head-on. Every burst from below was answered by a hailstorm from above. In 10 minutes, 6 Japanese planes went down. But they were almost out of ammo. And Ellison could see it, a new swarm forming on the horizon. "Hold your line," he said quietly into the comms. "We make our stand here." The Wildcats hung in a vortex of death, smoke, sunlight, and thunder. The ocean below was a sheet of silver glass, peppered with the debris of burning aircraft and drifting parachutes. Every gun barrel glowed red, every engine coughed and screamed as though alive. Ellison could taste the metal in his mouth, that tang of fear and oil mixed with oxygen-starved air. His plane rattled with every pull of the stick, bullet holes pocking the wings like small stars. "Commander," Davis called, his voice clipped. "I count 4 of us still breathing. Ammo's nearly gone. What's the move?" Ellison didn't answer right away. The Zeros were circling again, staying high now, wary. They'd learned. They wouldn't dive blindly into the storm again. He looked over the canopy and saw McCarthy's Wildcat wobbling, one wing shredded, trailing smoke. Holt was still with him, sticking close, though both were riddled with holes. "We bait again," Ellison said finally. "They think we're done. Let's make them think we're dead." He throttled back, letting his plane dip lower, almost to stall speed. The Zeros above, mistaking the move for damage, began to close in. 2 of them peeled off and dived, engines roaring. "Now!" Ellison snapped. The Wildcats suddenly flared upward in perfect synchronicity, 4 machines rising from the smoke like ghosts. The lead Zeros never saw it coming. Davis and Holt fired together, cutting one in half mid-roll. The second tried to climb away but caught a burst through the engine block. It erupted into a bright orange bloom that lit the clouds. "2 down!" Davis shouted. "Commander, we're running on fumes!" Ellison checked his gauges. Barely enough fuel to make it back to the Lexington. The fight had lasted nearly 20 minutes, though it felt like days. He pulled the stick, rising just enough to survey the horizon. The remaining Zeros were pulling back, regrouping into tight formation, retreating. Smoke rose from the sea beneath them, a trail of failure in their wake. "They're withdrawing," Holt said, disbelief in his voice. "Sir, they're actually leaving." Ellison didn't celebrate. He just exhaled, long and slow, his hand trembling on the throttle. "Let them. We'll call it even." The 4 Wildcats, scorched, battered, and low on everything but adrenaline, turned for home. Behind them, the Pacific swallowed the wreckage of 20 Japanese fighters. 4 planes had survived. And for the first time since the war began, the Wildcats weren't the hunted anymore. The flight back to the Lexington was a blur of smoke trails and silence. No chatter on the radio now, just the low hum of exhausted engines and the occasional cough of misfiring cylinders. The adrenaline had burned away, leaving only trembling hands and a heavy quiet that hung between them like fog. Ellison could see the carrier ahead, a gray smudge in the vast blue. The deck crew were already waving signal flags, spotting the returning aircraft. 4. Just 4. Out of 20 reported inbound Zeros, the Americans had faced them with 4 battered Wildcats, and somehow, impossibly, were flying home. "Break flight, this is Lexington Tower. You boys look like you've been to hell and back," came the calm, slightly incredulous voice of the landing officer. Ellison cracked a faint smile. "Roger that, Tower. Request priority landing. We're out of everything but prayers." "Copy, Brick 1. You're clear." He came in first. The arrestor hook caught the 3rd wire, jerking the Wildcat to a stop. The landing deck crew ran up immediately. One look at the shredded wings, the scorched paint, and they knew this was no ordinary patrol. The next 3 Wildcats came in one after another, limping but alive. When Davis climbed out, his knees gave way. McCarthy was bleeding from a cut along his scalp. Holt's hands shook so badly he couldn't undo his harness. No one spoke for a long moment. Then, one of the deck crew whistled softly. "You boys bring down that many with just 4 birds?" Ellison nodded once. "We brought down what came for us." He didn't mention the matchsticks. Not yet. The men needed rest, not legends. But when the squadron commander arrived, staring at the bullet holes and shell impacts, he said the words Ellison would remember forever. "You turned the tide, Jack. You made those Zeros bleed." Ellison looked out over the ocean. The sun was setting now, golden over the wreckage still burning on the horizon. He thought about the matchsticks on the table, the ridiculous idea that somehow worked. War wasn't about the fastest plane. It wasn't about who had more firepower. It was about who could keep thinking when death was already in the room. That night, the pilots gathered in the ready room, their faces half-lit by the red emergency lamps that kept the ship's deck night-friendly. The hum of the carrier engines thrummed beneath their boots. On the table between them sat 4 things, each one an ordinary wooden matchstick. Ellison picked one up and rolled it slowly between his fingers. "So," he began quietly, "you all remember how this started?" Davis nodded, leaning forward. "Yeah. You said a matchstick doesn't move when the flame jumps. It just changes direction." "That's right," Ellison said. "It burns fast, flares once, and dies, but it doesn't drift. It keeps its shape until the end. That's how we fight the Zeros. No drifting. No panic turns. Just fast, controlled burns." McCarthy chuckled dryly. "Hell of a metaphor, Skipper." But Holt was staring at the matches like they were something holy. "You think that's why we made it back?" Ellison didn't answer right away. He reached into his flight jacket and pulled out a crumpled sketch, arrows looping, intersecting, forming a pattern like a twisting storm. "This," he said, "is what happens when 4 matchsticks burn together." The diagram showed it clearly, each Wildcat crossing through the other's arcs at specific intervals. A dance of calculated defiance. One moment, a Zero had a target. The next, it was inside the overlapping kill zones of 3 other planes. The slower Wildcats had turned their weakness into a weapon of chaos. Every move we made out there today, Ellison continued, was a result of this pattern. The Zeros thought they were chasing one of us, but every time they picked one, they entered a noose. Davis leaned back, his voice quiet. You mean, it wasn't luck? No, Ellison said, setting the matchstick down. It was the first time they met men who stopped trying to outfly them and started outthinking them. Outside, the carrier deck was aglow of activity. The smell of fuel and salt filled the air. Somewhere, a mechanic swore as sparks flew from a welding torch. But in that ready room, surrounded by the ghosts of those who didn't come back, the four men sat in reverent silence. McCarthy finally broke it. So what do we call it, Skipper? Ellison smiled faintly. Call it the matchstick pattern. Something small enough to start a fire. They all laughed softly, the sound brittle but real. For the first time in months, the laughter didn't feel forced. Tomorrow, they knew, the war would continue, the skies over the Pacific still thick with smoke and fear. But tonight, aboard the Lexington, four battered men had rewritten the rules of aerial combat with nothing more than instinct, courage, and a handful of matchsticks. And by morning, the other pilots would hear about it. By week's end, the enemy would feel it. And by war's end, no one would forget it. By the next dawn, the Lexington's deck was alive again, crews shouting, cranes swinging, the thunder of engines testing on the launch line. But in the mess hall, something quieter stirred. A story spreading faster than smoke in a gale. The matchstick trick, they called it. Pilots from other squadrons leaned in as the tale was told and retold. How four Wildcats, slower, heavier, and supposedly outdated, had downed a swarm of Zeros by flying like sparks from a single flame. Some said it was impossible. Others said it was pure genius. But every man who'd been there swore by it. One flight officer, Lieutenant George Reeves, couldn't believe it. You mean they didn't climb or dive to break contact? He asked over his coffee. They just crossed paths like that. That's suicide. Not if you've got trust, replied Holt from across the table. Not if you fly like the man beside you is your own right wing. Ellison entered just then, still in his grease-stained flight jacket, and the room fell quiet. He hated the attention, but he knew what was coming. The commander of Air Wing 12 had already requested a briefing on the pattern. Naval intelligence wanted diagrams. Even the brass back in Pearl wanted to know what the hell a matchstick had to do with air combat. He smiled faintly. We didn't invent anything new, he told them. We just stopped flying scared. A silence followed, a silence that carried more weight than applause ever could. Every man in the room knew what that meant. For months, the American pilots had been reacting to the enemy, ducking, diving, playing defense in the enemy's sky. Now, for the first time, someone had taught them how to fight on their own terms. That afternoon, Ellison was summoned to the flag bridge. A staff officer handed him a coded transmission from Fleet Command. Effective immediately, it read. Implement coordinated crossfire pattern designated matchstick for all Pacific carrier operations. Report further results. Ellison stared at the message for a long time. Then, slowly, he folded it and slipped it into his pocket. The pattern that began with 4 matchsticks on a steel table had now become Navy doctrine. And somewhere in the Pacific, the Zeros were still circling, unaware that the next time they dived on a Wildcat, they'd be flying straight into a trap drawn by a handful of desperate men and a commander who had once stared at a burning match and seen something the rest of the world had missed. 2 weeks later, the matchstick pattern would face its greatest test. The USS Enterprise had joined the Lexington north of Guadalcanal, a massive target for Japanese bombers and their escorting Zeros. Radar operators picked up a formation approaching, over 50 contacts. The biggest airstrike yet. Ellison, now leading a mixed group of Wildcats from both carriers, climbed into the gray sky, the sea below glowing faintly gold. The radio crackled. Enemy at 12 o'clock high. The tension in every voice was unmistakable. They were outnumbered 3-1 again. Remember the matchstick, Ellison said calmly over the comms. We burn brighter together. The Wildcats broke into pairs, 4 at a time, forming the pattern they'd practiced 100 times since that night in the ready room. They climbed into the sun, holding tight formation, crossing lines, crisscrossing fields of fire, covering each other's blind spots. The first zeros fell on them like arrows. But this time, the American formation didn't break apart. Holt's pair rolled under one another, their tracers weaving into a single glowing web. One zero dove too low, caught in the crossfire, and exploded midair. Another tried to loop around, only to meet a curtain of .50 caliber fire from the intersecting flight. To the Japanese pilots, it was chaos. No single target, no lone wildcat trying to escape. Just an overlapping wall of defiance. The air was thick with smoke and shattered aluminum. At one point, a zero slashed past Ellison's canopy, close enough for him to see the pilot's face, wide-eyed, terrified. He squeezed the trigger, and the zero vanished in a burst of fire. "Lead, I'm hit but still flying," came Holt's voice. "Keep your line, we've got you," Ellison barked. The Americans fought like a single machine, 4 planes moving as one, turning disadvantage into precision. When it was over, the sky was eerily quiet. 27 zeros had been downed. The Wildcats lost only 3. As the squadron landed back on deck, sailors lined the rails, cheering. Ellison climbed down from his cockpit, grease and blood streaked across his face, and stared toward the horizon. The Pacific sun dipped low, its last light glinting off the deck like a dying match. The pattern had worked again, and this time, the flame had burned into legend. From that day forward, every pilot in the Pacific carried a simple superstition. Before every mission, they broke a matchstick in half and tucked it into their flight glove. Not for luck, but to remember the night a handful of desperate men learned that even the smallest spark could set the sky on fire.